In the remote mountain village of Whitehaven, a grieving veterinarian was about to face the storm of her life. What started as a routine evening check during Colorado's worst blizzard in 30 years took a shocking turn when she came face with a mysterious child collapsed in the snow. Dr. Elena Vasquez wasn't your typical small-town vet. For 2 years, she had spent her life healing wounded creatures in self-imposed isolation, known for her intuitive understanding of animal behavior and her reluctance to let anyone, human or otherwise, get too close. When she encountered the boy with unnaturally dark eyes, speaking in liquid musical tones, she had no idea she was walking into a hidden world of shapeshifters. Elena's instinct to heal that would lead to life debts, political upheaval, and a marriage proposal that could unite 2 species or ignite an ancient war. What began as saving one freezing child would become a bridge between worlds. The mountains would never be the same after a human veterinarian became the first of her kind to be offered a place among the Corvani and the target of those who would kill to prevent it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled like a living thing against the clinic's windows, rattling the glass with such violence that Dr. Elena Vasquez paused in her evening rounds to check the storm shutters. Snow pelted the building in horizontal sheets, each gust carrying the promise of a brutal night ahead. The Weather Service had called it the worst blizzard to hit the Colorado Rockies in 30 years, and from where Elena stood in her isolated veterinary clinic, she believed every word. She'd been through storms before. 2 years of mountain living had taught her to respect the weather's moods, but this felt different, more personal, as if the mountain itself had decided to test her resolve to remain hidden away in Whitehaven, population 47 on a good day. The emergency generator hummed steadily in the basement, a comforting reminder that she'd prepared. For this, her supplies were stocked, the animals in her small boarding area were settled, and she had enough coffee and canned soup to last a week if necessary. All she had to do was wait it out, alone with her thoughts and the familiar weight of grief that had driven her here in the first place. Elena pulled her wool cardigan tighter around her shoulders and moved toward the back door to check on the outdoor kennels one final time. Her hand had just touched the door handle when she saw it, a dark shape huddled against the building's foundation, barely visible through the swirling snow. Her breath caught. "What the hell?" Training took over. She grabbed her emergency medical kit, threw on her heaviest coat, and forced herself out into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and sending needles of ice through her clothing. The wind tried to knock her sideways, but she pressed forward, following the beam of her flashlight toward the motionless form. It was a child, a boy, maybe 12 years old, wearing clothes too thin for weather like this. He lay on his side in the snow, dark hair plastered to his scalp, skin pale as winter moonlight. Elena dropped to her knees beside him, her medical instincts pushing past the shock of finding anyone out here in these conditions. "Hey!" she called over the wind, pressing her fingers to his throat. A pulse, weak but steady. "Can you hear me?" No response. His lips had a bluish tinge that made her stomach clench with recognition. Severe hypothermia. He was maybe minutes away from cardiac arrest. Elena didn't waste time wondering how he'd gotten here or where he'd come from. Those questions could wait. Right now, she had a life to save. The journey back to the clinic took forever and no time at all. The boy was lighter than she'd expected, but the storm fought her every step. By the time she managed to get him inside, her lungs burned from the cold air and exertion. She carried him directly to the treatment room, placing him on the heated examination table before stripping away his wet clothes with practiced efficiency. The hypothermia was worse than she'd feared. His core temperature had to be dangerously low. But as she worked, Something nagged at her. Something that didn't quite fit. The boy's skin, though cold to the touch, had an odd resilience to it. His breathing, while shallow, was remarkably steady for someone in his condition, and his face, even unconscious, held a composure that seemed too mature for someone his age. Elena pushed the observations aside and focused on warming him gradually. Too fast could send him into shock. She wrapped him in heated blankets, started a warm saline IV, and positioned heat lamps to raise his body temperature slowly. As she worked, her boarding animals, a recovering hawk, 2 cats, and an old retriever, watched from their enclosures with unusual calm. Normally, the presence of a stranger would have them agitated, but tonight they seemed almost reverent. 20 minutes into treatment, the boy's eyes opened. Elena's breath caught. They were the darkest eyes she'd ever seen, not brown or black, but something deeper, like looking into a moonless night sky, and they were far too aware for someone who'd just been pulled back from hypothermia. "Where?" he began, then stopped. His voice carried a slight accent she couldn't place. When he tried again, the words that came out weren't English at all. They flowed like music, liquid and melodic, with consonants that seemed to click in unusual places. "Easy," Elena said, checking his pulse again. "Stronger now, but still not quite right. You're safe. You're in a veterinary clinic. I'm Dr. Vasquez." The boy's gaze fixed on her face with startling intensity. Then, in clear English, with only the faintest trace of that strange accent, he said, "The storm caught me. Thank you." "What's your name?" "Where are you from?" Elena asked, adjusting his blankets. "Your parents must be worried sick." Something flickered across his features, too quick to interpret. "Kyle," he said simply. "My name is Kyle." He didn't answer the second question. Outside, the storm reached a new level of fury. The building shuddered under the assault, and the lights flickered ominously. Elena glanced toward the windows, where snow had already begun accumulating against the glass in thick drifts. "Looks like we're going to be here a while," she said, more to herself than to Kyle. When she looked back at him, those unsettling dark eyes were studying her, with an expression that seemed far too old for his face. "Yes," he agreed quietly, "I think we are." The retriever in the corner kennel let out a soft whine, not of distress, but almost of greeting. Kyle turned his head toward the sound, and Eleanor could have sworn she saw the dog's tail wag in response. The hawk, too, had turned its head toward the boy, watching him with what looked distinctly like recognition. Elena frowned. In all her years of veterinary practice, she'd never seen animals react to a human quite like this. It was as if they knew something about Kyle that she didn't. The lights flickered again, and the generator's hum grew more pronounced. Outside, the wind screamed with renewed violence, and Elena realized that whatever secrets this strange boy carried, they would have to wait. The storm had trapped them together, and for now, that was all that mattered. But as she settled in to monitor Kyle's recovery through the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that finding him in the snow hadn't been an accident. Something about this boy, about the way her animals responded to him, about those two knowing eyes whispered that her quiet, isolated life in Whitehaven was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The blizzard raged on, sealing them together in the clinic's warm circle of light, while outside in the darkness the mountain kept its secrets. The blizzard raged on, sealing them together in the clinic's warm circle of light, while outside, in the darkness, the mountain kept its secrets. But as dawn broke on the second day, Elena began to suspect that some of those secrets had followed her patient inside. She dozed fitfully in the chair beside Kyle's makeshift bed, jerking awake, every few hours to check his vitals. His recovery was remarkable. Too remarkable, really, for someone who'd been minutes from death just 36 hours ago. His color had returned, his breathing was strong and steady, and his temperature had stabilized at a perfect 98.6. Any other patient would still be touch and go. What disturbed her more were the ravens. They'd started gathering at first light, perching along the clinic's roofline and windowsills. A few at first, then dozens, until the building was surrounded by a living black curtain of feathers and bright, intelligent eyes. They didn't caw or make noise. They simply watched, as if waiting for something. Elena had dealt with wildlife her entire career, but this was different. Ravens were social birds, but not like this. This felt organized, purposeful. They're beautiful, aren't they? Elena spun around to find Cale sitting up in bed, those dark eyes fixed on the window where at least 20 ravens perched in perfect silence. His voice was stronger now, carrying that melodic accent more clearly. "How long have you been awake?" she asked, moving to check his pulse automatically. Still too strong, too steady. "A while. I've been listening to them." Kyle tilted his head slightly, and Eleanor could have sworn she heard something, a subtle clicking sound, almost like the ravens were making outside. "They're concerned about me." Elena's hand stilled on his wrist. "Kyle, ravens don't get concerned about people. They're intelligent birds, but they don't form emotional attachments to humans." Something flickered across his face. Amusement, maybe, or sadness. "You're right, they don't get concerned about people." The way he emphasized the last word made Elena's skin prickle. She pulled her hand back, studying his face more carefully. In the morning light, she could see details she'd missed before. His bone structure was too refined, too symmetrical. His hair, now dry, had an almost blue-black sheen that reminded her of raven feathers, she said without thinking. Kyle's eyes widened slightly. "You see it." "I see that you're not entirely human." The words came out before Elena could stop them, her scientific mind finally giving voice to what her instincts had been screaming since she'd found him. "The question is, what are you?" For a long moment, Kyle said nothing. Outside, the ravens shifted restlessly, their silence somehow more ominous than any cawing would have been. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone far older than 12. "My people call ourselves the Corvani. We are the children of two worlds." Elena's rational mind rejected the implication immediately. Shapeshifters were mythology, folklore, the stuff of fantasy novels. But as she looked at Cale's otherworldly features, at the way her animals had responded to him, at the hundreds of ravens now covering every surface outside her clinic, that rational voice grew quieter. "That's impossible," she said, but her conviction, windows where snow had already begun accumulating against the glass in thick drifts. "Looks like we're going to be here a while," she said, more to herself than to Cale. When she looked back at him, those unsettling dark eyes were studying her, with an expression that seemed far too old for his face. "Yes," he agreed quietly, "I think we are." The retriever in the corner kennel let out a soft whine, not of distress, but almost of greeting. Kyle turned his head toward the sound, and Elena could have sworn she saw the dog's tail wag in response. The hawk, too, had turned its head toward the boy, watching him with what looked distinctly like recognition. Elena frowned. In all her years of veterinary practice, she'd never seen animals react to a human quite like this. It was as if they knew something about Cale that she didn't. The lights flickered again, and the generator's hum grew more pronounced. Outside, the wind screamed with renewed violence, and Elena realized that whatever secrets this strange boy carried, they would have to wait. The storm had trapped them together, and for now, that was all that mattered. But as she settled in to monitor Cale's recovery through the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that finding him in the snow hadn't been an accident. Something about this boy, about the way her animals responded to him, about those two knowing eyes whispered that her quiet, isolated life in Whitehaven was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The blizzard raged on, sealing them together in the clinic's warm circle of light, while outside in the darkness, the mountain kept its secrets. The blizzard raged on, sealing them together in the clinic's warm circle of light, while outside in the darkness, the mountain kept its secrets. But as dawn broke on the second day, Elena began to suspect that some of those secrets had followed her patient inside. She dozed fitfully in the chair beside Cale's makeshift bed, jerking awake every few hours to check his vitals. His recovery was remarkable. Too remarkable, really, for someone who'd been minutes from death just 36 hours ago. His color had returned, his breathing was strong and steady, and his temperature had stabilized at a perfect 98.6. Any other patient would still be touch and go. What disturbed her more were the ravens. They'd started gathering at first light, perching along the clinic's roofline and windowsills. A few at first, then dozens, until the building was surrounded by a living black curtain of feathers and bright, intelligent eyes. They didn't caw or make noise. They simply watched, as if waiting for something. Elena had dealt with wildlife her entire career, but this was different. Ravens were social birds, but not like this. Was wavering. Is it? Cale shifted in the bed, and Elena noticed how graceful the movement was. Too graceful, like he was accustomed to existing in a body that followed different rules. You've felt it, haven't you? The wrongness, the way I heal too fast, the way your animals react to me. Elena wanted to deny it, but she couldn't. Every veterinary instinct she possessed had been sending up warning flags since the moment she'd brought him inside. Even if I believed you, she said carefully, how does a 12-year-old end up alone in a blizzard? Kyle's expression grew somber. I was on my trial. When Corvani reach a certain age, we must spend time alone in both forms, learning to balance the two sides of our nature. I chose the worst possible night to test my limits. Trial, Elena repeated. You mean like a rite of passage? Something like that. Kyle hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Dr. Vasquez, what I'm about to show you will change everything between us. Once you see, you can never unsee. Are you certain you want this knowledge? Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. Every logical part of her brain screamed that she should say no, should find some rational explanation for all of this, should maintain the careful barriers she'd built around her isolated life. But a deeper part, the part that had driven her to become a healer in the first place, needed to know. Show me, she whispered. Kyle closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The change started slowly, so slowly that Elena almost missed it. His skin seemed to shimmer, taking on an iridescent quality that caught the light like oil on water. His hair darkened further, individual strands separating and reshaping into something that looked more like down than human hair. Then his fever spiked. Elena watched in fascination and growing alarm as Cale's body temperature shot up rapidly. Sweat beaded on his forehead and he began to convulse slightly. But this wasn't a medical emergency. It was transformation, attempting to happen in a body still recovering from hypothermia. Kyle! Elena reached for him but stopped when she saw his arm, where human skin should have been. Black feathers were erupting in patches. His fingers had begun to elongate, the bones reshaping with soft cracking sounds that should have been agonizing but seemed to cause him no pain. His face was changing too, becoming more angular, his nose sharpening into something that might become a beak. Then just as suddenly as it had started, the transformation reversed. The feathers melted back into skin, his bones snapped back into human configuration, and his fever broke. Kyle collapsed back onto the pillow, breathing hard, but smiling weakly. That wasn't supposed to happen like that, he said, his voice hoarse. I'm still too weak for a full change. Elena stared at him, her world tilting on its axis. Everything she thought she knew about reality had just been rewritten in the space of 30 seconds. "You're a shapeshifter," she said, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "You actually turn into a raven." A crow, technically. Ravens are our cousins, but not the same. Kale struggled to sit up, and Elena automatically moved to help him, her healer's instincts overriding her shock. "The Corvani have lived in these mountains for thousands of years, hidden from your kind. We've learned that humans and difference don't mix well." Elena thought about every folklore tale she'd ever heard about the mountains, every unexplained animal behavior she'd witnessed in her 2 years here. "How many of you are there? Enough to have our own society, our own laws, our own problems." Kyle's expression grew troubled. "Which brings me to something important, Dr. Vasquez. By saving my life, you've created what my people call a life debt." "Which means what exactly?" "It means that my life belongs to you until that debt is repaid. It's one of our oldest laws, and it cannot be ignored." Kyle met her eyes directly. "It also means that my family will come looking for me. And when they discover what you've done, windows where snow had already begun accumulating against the glass in thick drifts. Looks like we're going to be here a while," she said, more to herself than to Kyle. When she looked back at him, those unsettling dark eyes were studying her, with an expression that seemed far too old for his face. "Yes," he agreed quietly, "I think we are." The retriever in the corner kennel let out a soft whine, not of distress, but almost of greeting. Kyle turned his head toward the sound, and Elena could have sworn she saw the dog's tail wag in response. The hawk, too, had turned its head toward the boy, watching him with what looked distinctly like recognition. Elena frowned. In all her years of veterinary practice, she'd never seen animals react to a human quite like this. It was as if they knew something about Kale that she didn't. The lights flickered again, and the generator's hum grew more pronounced. Outside, the wind screamed with renewed violence, and Elena realized that whatever secrets this strange boy carried, they would have to wait. The storm had trapped them together, and for now, that was all that mattered. But as she settled in to monitor Kyle's recovery through the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that finding him in the snow hadn't been an accident. Something about this boy, about the way her animals responded to him, about those two knowing eyes whispered that her quiet, isolated life in Whitehaven was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The blizzard raged on, sealing them together in the clinic's warm circle of light, while outside in the darkness, the mountain kept its secrets. The blizzard raged on, sealing them together in the clinic's warm circle of light, while outside in the darkness, the mountain kept its secrets. But as dawn broke on the second day, Elena began to suspect that some of those secrets had followed her patient inside. She dozed fitfully in the chair beside Kyle's makeshift bed, jerking awake every few hours to check his vitals. His recovery was remarkable, too remarkable, really, for someone who'd been minutes from death just 36 hours ago. His color had returned, his breathing was strong and steady, and his temperature had stabilized at a perfect 98.6. Any other patient would still be touch and go. What disturbed her more were the ravens. They'd started gathering at first light, perching along the clinic's roofline and windowsills. A few at first, then dozens, until the building was surrounded by a living black curtain of feathers and bright, intelligent eyes. They didn't caw or make noise. They simply watched, as if waiting for something. Elena had dealt with wildlife her entire career, but this was different. Ravens were social birds, but not like this. He trailed off, but Elena could hear the unspoken implications in his silence. Outside, the ravens had grown agitated, their silent vigil broken by soft, rustling sounds as they shifted position. "Are you saying I'm in danger?" Elena asked. "I'm saying everything is about to change." Kyle's voice carried a weight far beyond his apparent years. "My uncle is the war chief of our clan. When he learns that a human has saved my life, he'll have to respond according to our laws. The debt must be acknowledged." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "And if it's not?" "It will be," Kyle said with quiet certainty. "Theron Nightwing has never ignored tradition. The question is what form that acknowledgement will take." As if summoned by his words, the ravens outside suddenly took flight in perfect unison, their wings creating a thunderous sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the clinic. Through the window, Elena watched as they formed a tight spiral in the grey sky before dispersing in all directions like messengers carrying urgent news. "They're telling my people where I am," Kyle explained, noting her expression. "I'd estimate we have perhaps 3 days before they arrive." 3 days, Elena repeated numbly. 3 days before her quiet, isolated life was invaded by shapeshifting beings from what amounted to a hidden civilization. 3 days before she had to face the consequences of a simple act of compassion. "Dr. Vasquez," Kyle said gently, "I know this is overwhelming, but I want you to understand. What you did for me saving my life, it matters, in ways you can't yet comprehend." Elena looked at this strange boy, who was somehow both child and ancient soul, human and something entirely other. Her scientific mind was still reeling, trying to process the impossible thing she'd witnessed. But her heart, the part of her that had been locked away since the accident that took everything from her, was stirring with something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Purpose, connection, the sense that her life might be about to have meaning again. "When they come," she said finally, "your people, what should I expect?" Cale's smile was both grateful and sad. "Expect everything you think you know about the world to change. Expect to discover that the mountains hold more secrets than you ever imagined." He paused, those dark eyes holding hers. "And expect to learn what it truly means to be part of something larger than yourself." Outside, the last of the ravens disappeared into the grey sky, carrying their messages to a hidden world Elena was only just beginning to understand existed. She watched them go with a mixture of fear and anticipation, knowing that when they returned, they would bring with them answers to questions she'd never thought to ask. The storm was finally beginning to weaken, but Elena suspected that the real tempest was yet to come. The storm was finally beginning to weaken, but Elena suspected that the real tempest was yet to come. She didn't have to wait long to find out. They arrived at dawn on the 3rd day, just as Cale had predicted. Elena was checking on the recovering hawk when the sky darkened with wings. Not the scattered messengers of before, but a coordinated formation that moved with military precision. 7 massive crows, larger than any she'd ever seen, circled the clinic once before, landing in the snow-covered courtyard. The transformation was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. Elena watched through the window as the birds folded in on themselves, their forms shifting and flowing like liquid shadow. Bones elongated, feathers dissolved into skin and clothing, and within moments 7 figures stood where the crows had been. They were tall and lean, dressed in dark leather and furs that seemed to absorb the morning light. Each carried weapons, curved, blades that looked both ancient and deadly, but it was the woman leading them who commanded Elena's attention. She was perhaps 16, with the same blue-black hair as Kyle and eyes that held the fierce intelligence of a natural predator. When she moved, it was with a predator's grace, every step calculated and purposeful. "That's my sister," Kyle said quietly from behind Elena. "Zara." Elena turned to find him dressed in the clothes she'd provided, jeans and a sweater that hung loose on his small frame. But his posture had changed, becoming more formal, more regal. The weight of his heritage was settling back onto his shoulders. "She looks Intense, Elena said. She's protective, and she's been training to be a warrior since she could walk. Kyle moved toward the door, then stopped. Dr. Vasquez, whatever happens, I want you to know that these past few days have meant everything to me. You showed me kindness when you had no reason to. That's not something my people will forget. Before Elena could respond, the clinic door opened without a knock. Zara stepped inside, her keen gaze sweeping the room before settling on Kyle. Relief flickered across her features for just a moment before her warrior's mask slipped back into place. "Brother," she said, her voice carrying the same musical accent as Kyle's, but with an edge of command. "You've caused quite a stir." "I know. I'm sorry." Kyle straightened further, and Elena could see him falling back into whatever role he played within their society. The storm was stronger than I anticipated. Zara's attention shifted to Elena, and those dark eyes seemed to catalogue every detail, her posture, her expression, the way she instinctively moved closer to Kyle. "And you are the human who found him." It wasn't a question, but Elena answered anyway. "Dr. Elena Vasquez. I run this clinic. A healer." Zara stepped closer, and Elena caught the scent of wind and winter air that seemed to cling to her. "Kyle has been speaking of little else but your kindness since we arrived. He says you saved his life. I did what anyone would do." "No," Zara said firmly. "You did what few would do. You brought a stranger into your home during a deadly storm, cared for him without question or expectation of reward. That is not common even among your people." Two more Corvani entered the clinic, warriors who positioned themselves near the exits with casual efficiency. Elena's heart rate picked up, but Kyle moved to stand beside her. "Zara, Dr. Vasquez, has been nothing but kind to me. She deserves our respect." His sister studied Elena for a long moment, then did something unexpected. She smiled, and the expression transformed her entire face from stern warrior to concerned sibling. "Peace, little brother. We're not here to threaten your healer." Zara turned back to Elena. "But we do need to understand what has passed between you. The life debt Kale speaks of is no small matter." "I don't understand what that means," Elena said honestly. "I just treated his hypothermia and made sure he was safe." "You preserved the life of a Nightwing," one of the other warriors said, speaking for the first time. "The nephew of our war chief. Such a debt carries weight in our world." Kale stepped forward, his young voice carrying surprising authority. "I have told them how you cared for me, how you asked for nothing in return. I have told them you are crow-hearted despite being human." "Crow-hearted?" Elena asked. "It means you understand what matters," Zara explained. "Family, loyalty, the willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves." She paused, studying Elena's face. "It is a high compliment among our people." What happened next caught Elena completely off guard. Zara moved to stand directly in front of her, then placed her hands on Elena's shoulders. The touch was warm, and Elena felt an odd, tingling sensation, as if static electricity was building between them. "By the old laws and the new, by wind and wing and the bonds that bind us all," Zara said, her voice taking on a formal cadence, "I mark you as friend to the clan Nightwing. Let all Corvani know that Elena Vasquez has earned our protection and our respect." The tingling intensified, and Elena gasped as she felt something change. Not physically. She looked the same when she glanced down at herself, but something deeper had shifted. She felt marked somehow, connected to something larger than herself. "What did you do?" she asked. "Gave you a gift," Kyle said softly, "and a responsibility. You're part of our world now, whether you understand it or not." The reality of their departure hit Elena suddenly. These past 3 days had been unlike anything in her life, challenging everything she thought she knew about the world. Awakening, feelings she'd thought buried forever, and now they were leaving, taking that magic with them. "When will I see you again?" she asked Cale, not caring if the question revealed too much about how much his presence had meant to her. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I will remember you always, and the debt remains." Zara stepped back, her expression softening as she watched the exchange between Elena and her brother. "The mountains have long memories, Dr. Vasquez, and we do not forget our debts." The goodbye was harder than Elena had expected. Cale hugged her tightly, and she was surprised by how much she'd grown to care for this strange, wise child in such a short time. When he pulled back, his dark eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Take care of yourself," she whispered. "And you, do the same." Elena stood in her doorway and watched as the Corvani prepared to leave. One by one they transformed back into their crow forms, the change smooth and effortless in the morning light. Only Zara remained in human form for a moment longer. "The marking I gave you," she said quietly, "it will let our people know you are under our protection. But more than that, it will let you recognize us when we are near. You are part of our world now, Elena Vasquez. That connection cannot be broken." Then she too transformed, her form dissolving into feathers and wind. The 7 crows rose into the sky in perfect formation, circling once over the clinic before disappearing into the mountain peaks. Elena stood alone in the sudden silence, feeling the weight of emptiness settle around her like a familiar coat. The clinic felt different now, too quiet, too small, too ordinary after 3 days of magic and impossibility. She was still standing there 20 minutes later when she heard the crunch of footsteps in the snow. Old Henrik appeared around the corner of the building, moving with the careful gait of someone who'd lived in these mountains for decades. He was her nearest neighbor, a retired forest ranger who checked on her occasionally. "Morning, Doc," he called out, his weathered face creased with what might have been concern. "Saw some unusual bird activity around here the past few days. Everything all right?" Elena studied his expression more carefully. There was something in his eyes, a knowing quality that hadn't been there before, or maybe she was just noticing it for the first time. "Everything's fine, Henrik, just dealing with some unusual patience." Henrik nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the sky where the Corvani had disappeared. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the crow people, said they lived in the high places, keeping their own counsel. Most folks thought she was touched, but she swore she'd seen them with her own eyes." "Just stories, though," Elena said carefully. "Maybe." Henrik's smile was enigmatic. "Then again, these mountains are old, Doc, older than most people realize. They've got their secrets, and sometimes those secrets find their way down to visit us ordinary folks." He started to leave, then paused. "Your young visitor. He get home safe?" Elena's breath caught. Henrik hadn't been here when Kyle arrived, hadn't seen him leave. "How did you—" "Like I said, the mountains have long memories, and some of us remember the old stories better than others." Henrik touched the brim of his cap. "You take care of yourself, Doc, and don't be surprised if you find yourself part of something bigger than you expected." As Henrik disappeared back down the trail, Elena touched her shoulder where Zara had placed her hands. She could still feel the echo of that strange marking, the sense of connection to something vast and hidden. The magical chapter was closing, but something told her the story was far from over. The magical chapter was closing, but something told her the story was far from over. Elena had been telling herself that for 3 months now, and with each passing day, the conviction grew weaker. Spring had come to the mountains with its usual reluctance, bringing patches of green to break the monotony of snow and stone. Elena's clinic had returned to its normal rhythm. Vaccinations for the village pets, treating the occasional injured wildlife, the steady, predictable work that had once provided her with purpose. But now it all felt hollow, like going through the motions of a life that no longer quite fit. She found herself watching the sky more than she cared to admit. Every dark shape that crossed her peripheral vision made her heart skip. Every raven that landed near the clinic received careful scrutiny. But they were just birds. Ordinary corvids going about their ordinary business, with none of the intelligence or purpose she'd seen in Kale's guardians. The marking Zara had given her remained, though it had settled into something more subtle over time. She could feel it sometimes, like a warm pulse beneath her skin, particularly when ravens were near. But it had brought no messages, no sign that the Corvani remembered her existence. Elena was cleaning surgical instruments when she heard the familiar crunch of boots on gravel. Through the window, she saw Henrik approaching, moving with his characteristic measured pace. His visits had become more frequent since Kale's departure, and she'd begun to suspect they weren't entirely social calls. "Afternoon, Doc," Henrik called as he entered. "Got a minute?" "Always do for you," Elena replied, setting down her instruments. "Coffee?" "Wouldn't say no." As Elena busied herself with the coffee maker, Henrik settled into the chair by her desk, the same chair where she'd watched over Kyle during those first crucial hours. The parallel wasn't lost on her. "Been thinking about those stories I mentioned," Henrik said without preamble, "about my grandmother and the Crow people." Elena's hand stilled on the coffee pot. Over the past few months, Henrik had been sharing increasingly detailed accounts of his grandmother's encounters with what she'd called the Old Ones. At first, Elena had assumed they were just mountain folklore, but the specifics were beginning to match too closely with what she'd learned from Kyle. "What about them?" "Well, I was going through some of her old things last week. Found a journal I'd never seen before." Henrik pulled a leather-bound book from his jacket, its pages yellowed with age. "Thought you might find it interesting." Elena accepted the journal with careful hands. The leather was soft with age, and when she opened it, the pages released. The scent of lavender and old paper. The handwriting was spidery but legible, and the first entry made her breath catch. "They came again today, 3 of them in crow form. The young one I've been treating is healing well, broken wing mending faster than any bird I've seen. When he changed back to speak with me, his gratitude was profound. They are not what the old stories make them out to be. They are people, with families and concerns and hearts that can be broken just like ours." "Henrik," Elena whispered, looking up at him, "your grandmother knew them, really knew them." "Aye, been a connection between our families and theirs for generations, seems like. She never spoke of it directly. Too dangerous, she always said. But she made sure I knew the signs, knew how to recognize them when they came around." Elena flipped through more pages, finding detailed accounts of Corvani visitors, descriptions of their society, even rough maps of territories in the higher peaks. "Why are you showing me this now?" Henrik's weathered face was grave. "Because something's coming, Doc. My old bones can feel it. The patterns are shifting, and when they do, folks like us who bridge the worlds, well, we tend to find ourselves in the middle of things." Before Elena could respond, the sound of a car engine interrupted them. She looked out to see a familiar silver sedan pulling up to the clinic, and her stomach dropped. "Dr. Marcus Webb," she said under her breath. "Friend of yours?" Henrik asked, noting her tone. "Former colleague, from my old life." And Marcus emerged from the car, looking exactly as Elena remembered him. Tall, distinguished, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from a lifetime of being the smartest person in most rooms. He wore an expensive coat that was completely inappropriate for mountain terrain, and his shoes were already collecting mud from the unpaved driveway. "Elena," he called out, spreading his arms as if expecting her to run into them. "God, it's good to see you. You look healthy." The pause before healthy suggested he'd been about to say something else entirely. Elena was acutely aware of how she must appear to him. Hair longer and wilder than she'd ever worn it in the city, clothes practical rather than fashionable, skin tanned from mountain sun. "Marcus, this is unexpected. I was in Denver for a conference. Thought I'd make the drive up to see how you're doing." His gaze swept the clinic with barely concealed disdain. "Living the dream, I see." Henrik rose from his chair with deliberate slowness. "I'll be heading out, Doc. Let you catch up with your friend." He pressed the journal into Elena's hands. "Take your time with that. And remember what I said about patterns shifting." After Henrik left, Marcus looked around the clinic with the expression of someone trying to understand how anyone could choose this life voluntarily. "Elena, what are you doing to yourself up here? This place is barely civilization." "It's home," she said simply. "No, it's not. It's hiding." Marcus moved closer, his voice taking on the persuasive tone she remembered from their research presentations. "Listen, I didn't just happen to be in Denver. I came specifically to talk to you. We've been awarded the Morrison Grant, $2 million for wildlife disease research. We could establish our own lab, pursue any project we want. But the offer is only good if the whole team comes back together." Elena felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The Morrison Grant had been their dream project, something they'd worked toward for years before her world fell apart. 2 years ago, she would have been ecstatic. "I'm honored that you thought of me, Marcus, but nothing. Elena, you're wasting your talents up here, playing country vet with injured squirrels when you could be making real contributions to science, to medicine." He gestured around the clinic. "This isn't living, it's existing. You're letting grief define your entire life." The words hit harder than he probably intended, echoing doubts she'd been fighting for months. Was that what she was doing? Had her encounter with Kyle and the Corvani been nothing more than her grief-stricken mind latching onto fantasy as an escape from reality? "It's not that simple," she said. "It is exactly that simple. Pack up whatever you need, drive back to Denver with me today. We can have you back in the lab by next week." Marcus reached for her hand. "Elena, I've missed working with you. We were a good team. We could be again." Elena looked down at their joined hands and felt nothing. No spark, no sense of coming home, no recognition of the life she'd once lived. If anything, his touch felt foreign, like wearing clothes that no longer fit. "I can't," she said, pulling her hand away. "Can't or won't. Both." Elena moved to the window, looking out at the mountains that had become her sanctuary. "Marcus, I appreciate the offer. I really do. But this is my life now. This isn't a life. It's a retreat. You're 34 years old, Elena. How long are you going to hide from the world?" Elena turned back to face him, and for the first time since he'd arrived, her voice carried real conviction. "I'm not hiding. For the first time in 2 years, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Marcus stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. "What the hell happened to you up here?" Elena almost laughed. How could she explain that she'd discovered there were worlds within worlds, that shapeshifters lived in the mountains, that she'd been marked by beings of myth and legend? How could she tell him that she'd found a sense of purpose and connection that their old life of sterile labs and academic competition had never provided? "I found something important," she said finally. "More important than groundbreaking research? More important than making a real difference in the world?" "Yes." The word hung between them, final and absolute. Marcus studied her face for a long moment, then shook his head. I don't understand you anymore, Elena. The woman I knew would never have walked away from an opportunity like this. Maybe the woman you knew needed to grow, Elena replied quietly. Marcus gathered his coat with sharp, frustrated movements. The offer stands until the end of the month. When you come to your senses, call me. After he left, Elena stood alone in the clinic, holding Henrik's grandmother's journal. She opened it to a random page and found a passage that made her heart race. Young Thomas Nightwing visited again today. His nephew is doing well. The fever broke and he's eating on his own now. Thomas spoke of debts and obligations, of old laws that bind their people. He says the debt his family owes me will not be forgotten, that someday it will be repaid in ways I cannot imagine. I told him that saving a child is reward enough, but he only smiled that sad smile of his and said, "The Corvani remember everything. Sarah, everything." Elena's hands trembled as she read the name, Nightwing. Kyle had said his uncle was Theron Nightwing, war chief of their clan. This Thomas had to be an ancestor, perhaps Theron's grandfather or great-grandfather. The connections ran deeper than she'd ever imagined. She looked out at the mountains with new eyes, understanding finally settling into her bones. This wasn't about grief or hiding or escaping from reality. This was about belonging to something larger than herself, about being part of a story that stretched back generations. Marcus was wrong. She wasn't wasting her life up here. She was preparing for whatever came next. As if summoned by her thoughts, a single raven landed on her windowsill. It was larger than most, with eyes that seemed too intelligent for an ordinary bird. It looked directly at her for a long moment, then cawed once, a sound that seemed almost like a greeting before taking flight toward the high peaks. Elena pressed her hand to her shoulder, where Zara's marking pulsed warm beneath her skin. The waiting was almost over. She could feel it in her bones, in the wind that carried whispers of change down from the mountains. Something was coming. And for the first time in months, Elena felt ready for it. Something was coming. And for the first time in months, Elena felt ready for it. She didn't have to wait long. He arrived at sunset 3 days later, when the mountains were painted in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to set the very air on fire. Elena was in her garden, tending to the medicinal herbs she'd been cultivating, when the sky darkened with a single massive shape. The crow that descended toward her clinic was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Its wingspan had to be at least 8 feet, and its feathers held an iridescent quality that shifted between black and deep blue as it moved. This wasn't just any Corvani. This was someone of immense power and authority. Elena straightened slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs as the great bird landed in her courtyard with a grace that defied its size. For a moment, it simply regarded her with eyes that held depths of intelligence and ancient wisdom. Then, the transformation began. Where Kyle's change had been halting and incomplete, this was poetry in motion. The crow folded in on itself with fluid precision, bones reshaping with sounds like wind through trees, feathers melting into fabric and skin. Within seconds, a man stood where the bird had been. Elena's breath caught. He was tall, easily 6.5 feet, with the same blue-black hair as Kale and Zara, but his carried threads of silver at the temples. His face was angular and aristocratic, marked by lines that spoke of both command and sorrow. He wore clothing that seemed to blend medieval and modern sensibilities, dark leather and fine wool cut in styles that belonged to no human fashion. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the same dark depths as Kyle's, but layered with years of responsibility and carefully controlled power. "Dr. Elena Vasquez," he said, and his voice carried the mountain wind itself, deep, resonant and touched with that musical accent she'd grown to recognize. "I am Theron Nightwing, war chief of the Northern Corvani clan. I believe you know my nephew." Elena found her voice with effort. "Kyle. Yes, Is he well?" Something that might have been approval flickered across Theron's features. "He is thriving thanks to your care. That is why I'm here." "Would you like to come inside?" Elena asked, gesturing toward the clinic. "I can make coffee or tea." "Thank you, but this conversation requires the open sky." Theron's gaze swept the mountains around them with the familiarity of someone who'd claimed them as his domain. "What I have to discuss with you involves matters that cannot be contained within walls." Elena nodded, though she wasn't sure why. Something about his presence commanded respect in a way that felt natural rather than imposed. "What did you want to discuss?" "The debt my family owes you." "I've told everyone. There's no debt. I just did what anyone would do." Theron's expression grew grave. "Dr. Vasquez, you saved the life of the heir to our clan leadership. Kyle is not just my nephew. He is my brother's son, and since my brother's death, he represents the future of our people. The debt created by your actions cannot be dismissed or ignored." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means that by the oldest laws of our people, your life and mine are now bound together until that debt is repaid." Theron took a step closer, and Elena caught the scent of wind and winter that seemed to cling to him. "There are several ways such a debt can be honored. I could offer you wealth, though I suspect material possessions hold little appeal for you. I could grant you a boon, a single request that would be fulfilled no matter the cost. Or—" He paused, and Elena saw something shift in his expression, uncertainty replacing the formal authority he'd worn like armor. "Or," she prompted, "or I could offer you something that has never been offered to a human in the history of our people." Theron's voice dropped, becoming almost intimate, despite the formal words. "I could offer you a place among us, as my equal, as my partner in leadership." Elena stared at him, certain she'd misunderstood. "I'm sorry, what?" "I'm asking you to marry me, Dr. Vasquez." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge to reality itself. Elena felt the world tilt, as if the mountains themselves had shifted on their foundations. "You're asking me to marry you," she repeated slowly. "You, who I met 5 minutes ago. You're asking me to marry you to pay off a debt I don't think I'm owed." "Yes." The simple directness of his answer was somehow more overwhelming than any elaborate explanation would have been. Elena sank onto the bench beside her herb garden, her legs suddenly unsteady. "This is insane," she said. "Is it?" Theron moved to stand before her, but didn't sit. "You saved the life of someone precious to me when you had every reason to turn away. You nursed him back to health, asked for nothing in return, and sent him back to us safely. In doing so, you demonstrated the qualities my people value most: compassion, courage, and strength in the face of the unknown. Those are nice qualities for a friend. They're not necessarily marriage material, aren't they?" Theron's voice carried a note of something Elena couldn't quite identify. "Dr. Vasquez, I have spent 15 years leading my people. I have negotiated treaties, commanded warriors in battle, and made decisions that affect the lives of thousands. In all that time, I have never met anyone, human or Corvani, who combined such skill as a healer with such natural understanding of what truly matters." Elena looked up at him, trying to process the impossibility of what he was saying. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me except that I helped Kale. I know more than you think." Theron's expression softened slightly. "I know that you lost someone you loved and retreated to these mountains to heal. I know that you've been searching for purpose, for a sense of belonging that your old life couldn't provide. I know that when you marked my nephew as worthy of your protection, something in you recognized a kindred spirit." The accuracy of his assessment made Elena's chest tighten. "How could you possibly know all that?" "Because I've been watching you, Dr. Vasquez, not spying, observing, learning who you are when you think no one is paying attention." Theron's voice grew quieter. "And what I've learned is that you're exactly the kind of person our people need as we face the challenges ahead." "What challenges?" Theron's expression grew grim. "Change is coming to the Corvani, whether we will it or not. The old ways of complete separation from humanity are no longer sustainable. We need leaders who understand both worlds, who can bridge the gap between what we've always been and what we might become." Elena felt the weight of implications settling around her like a heavy cloak. "And you think I could be that kind of leader?" "I think you already are." The conviction in his voice made something flutter in Elena's chest. Not just attraction, though she was beginning to recognize that as well, but a sense of possibility she hadn't felt since before her world fell apart. "This is all theoretical, though," she said, grasping for rationality. "Even if I were to consider such an arrangement, surely your people would never accept a human leader. Some would, others." Theron's jaw tightened. "Others would see it as an abomination that threatens everything we are." "That sounds dangerous." "It would be." Theron met her eyes directly. "I won't lie to you, Dr. Vasquez. Accepting my proposal would put you in considerable danger. There are factions among our people who believe that any mixing with humanity will lead to our destruction. They would see our union as a declaration of war against tradition itself." Elena thought of Cassius Ravenclaw, the name Cale had mentioned, with such wariness. What would happen if I said yes? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You would become the first human ever formally accepted into Corvani society. You would share in the leadership of our clan, help guide our people through the changes ahead. You would have access to knowledge and experiences beyond anything your current world could offer. And if I said no? Something flickered across Theron's features. Disappointment, perhaps, or relief that the decision would be taken from him. Then the debt would remain unpaid, and I would be honor-bound to find another way to fulfill our obligations to you. Elena stood and walked to the edge of her garden, looking out at the mountains that had become her refuge. 2 years ago, she'd come here to hide from a world that had taken everything she loved. She'd built a small, safe life where the only risks were the ones she chose to take. Now, this man, this otherworldly, impossibly compelling man, was offering her something that would shatter that safety completely. A chance to be part of something larger than herself, to matter in ways she'd never imagined possible. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course." Theron moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "But I should warn you, time may be a luxury we don't have much of. The factions I mentioned are already moving. They know about you, about the debt, about what I intend to propose. How long do I have?" "Days, perhaps. Maybe less." Theron turned to face her fully, and Elena was struck by the vulnerability she saw beneath his commanding exterior. "Dr. Vasquez, Elena, I know this seems impossible. I know I'm asking you to trust a stranger with your life, your future, everything you are, but I want you to understand something." "What?" "This proposal began as duty. The debt demanded a response, and this seemed like the most honorable solution." Theron's voice dropped, becoming almost intimate. "But the more I've learned about The more I've come to realize that duty isn't the only thing driving me anymore. Elena's breath caught. What else is driving you? The hope that I might finally have found someone who could truly understand the burden of leadership. Someone who could stand beside me, not as a subordinate, but as an equal. Theron's dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made her heart race. Someone who could help me remember what it feels like to hope for something beyond mere survival. The admission hung between them, raw and honest in a way that stripped away all pretense. Elena found herself leaning toward him, drawn by something deeper than physical attraction, a recognition of kindred spirits who'd both learned to carry more weight than they'd ever wanted. "I'll need to see your world," she said quietly. "If I'm going to consider this, I need to understand what I'd be stepping into." Theron's smile was like sunrise breaking over mountain peaks. "I was hoping you'd say that." Part 6. The Hidden World. Theron's smile was like sunrise breaking over mountain peaks. "I was hoping you'd say that." The transformation from man to crow was even more breathtaking the second time Elena witnessed it. Theron's change carried a controlled power that spoke of decades of practice, his form flowing seamlessly between human and avian with an elegance that made her earlier glimpses of Corvani shapeshifting seem clumsy by comparison. Within moments, the massive crow stood before her, wings spread in invitation. "I've never flown before," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. The great bird's eyes held unmistakable amusement, and somehow Elena could hear Theron's voice in her mind. Warm, reassuring, touched with gentle humor. "Trust me, the sensation of leaving the ground was unlike anything Elena had ever experienced." Theron's talons gripped her shoulders with careful strength, his powerful wings carrying them upward with smooth, measured beats. The clinic fell away. Beneath them, shrinking to a toy-sized building nestled among the pines, and Elena felt her stomach drop as the true magnitude of what was happening hit her. She was flying, actually flying, held aloft by a man who could become a crow, on her way to see a hidden city that shouldn't exist. The rational part of her mind wanted to panic, but the rest of her was overwhelmed by pure wonder. The landscape unfolded below them like a living map. Elena could see patterns in the forest she'd never noticed from ground level, game trails threading between the trees, hidden meadows where deer grazed in the fading light, and far above, the jagged peaks that formed the backbone of the continent. The wind rushed past her face, carrying scents of pine and snow and something else, something wild and free that made her heart race with exhilaration. They flew for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, climbing steadily, toward peaks that seemed too high and too remote for human habitation. Elena was beginning to wonder where exactly they were going when Theron angled toward what appeared to be a solid rock face. Then the illusion parted like a curtain. Elena gasped as they passed through what must have been the most sophisticated camouflage she'd ever seen. One moment they were flying toward blank stone, the next they were gliding into a vast hidden canyon that opened up like a secret world carved from the mountain itself. Ethermore spread before them in impossible splendor. The city was built into the canyon walls themselves, with buildings that seemed to grow directly from the living rock. Spires twisted upward like frozen waterfalls, connected by bridges that looked like they'd been woven from starlight and cloud. Gardens cascaded down the cliff faces in terraced abundance, and everywhere Elena looked, she saw the graceful forms of Corvani moving between human and crow shapes with effortless fluidity. But it was the light that truly took her breath away. The city glowed with a soft radiance that seemed to come from the stone itself, as if the very walls had been infused with captured moonlight. Streets and walkways curved in organic patterns that followed the natural contours of the rock, creating a harmony between architecture and nature that human cities had never achieved. Theron landed on a broad platform near the city's heart, transforming back to human form as he gently set Elena on her feet. She stood there for a moment, trying to process the magnitude of what she was seeing. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and the words felt utterly inadequate. "Welcome to Ethermore," Theron said, pride evident in his voice, "the last free city of the Corvani." Before Elena could respond, they were approached by a group of figures who moved with the distinctive grace she was learning to associate with Theron's people. At their head walked a woman who immediately commanded attention, tall and elegant, with the same dark hair as other Corvani, but eyes that held flecks of silver like chips of starlight. "So," the woman said, her voice carrying musical tones, layered with unmistakable authority, "this is the human who has captured our war chief's attention." Elena felt the weight of scrutiny as the woman studied her with an intensity that was both clinical and personal. There was intelligence in those silver-flecked eyes, but also something harder, calculation perhaps, or judgment. "Elena Vasquez," Theron said formally, "may I present Mira Stormfeather, my chief advisor and the finest strategic mind in our clan." Mira inclined her head with regal precision. "Dr. Vasquez, your reputation precedes you." "Does it?" Elena asked, uncertain whether that was good or bad. "Oh yes, the human who saved young Kale has become quite the topic of conversation in our halls." Mira's smile was perfectly polite and completely unreadable, though I confess I expected someone different. Different how? Larger, perhaps, more obviously formidable. Mira circled Elena slowly, like a predator evaluating potential prey. "You seem quite ordinary for someone who has managed to turn our entire social order upside down." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Theron stepped forward. "Mira, Dr. Vasquez is our guest. She deserves courtesy." "Of course, forgive me." Mira's expression didn't change, but something in her tone sharpened. "I simply find it fascinating that someone so diminutive could have such a profound impact on our people's future." The insult was delivered with such elegant precision that it took Elena a moment to realize she'd been insulted at all. When understanding hit, she felt a familiar spark of the determination that had carried her through veterinary school and the early years of building her practice. "I may be small," Elena said evenly, "but I've found that size matters less than knowing what you're doing." Mira's eyebrows rose slightly, and Elena caught what might have been approval in her expression. "Indeed. Well, shall we proceed to the council? They're eager to meet the woman who may become our first human leader." The council chambers were carved from a single massive geode, its crystalline walls refracting the city's soft light into rainbow patterns that danced across the gathered faces. Elena counted 23 Corvani arranged in a loose circle, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. "Honored Council," Theron began, his voice carrying the formal cadence of ceremony, "I present Dr. Elena Vasquez, healer and friend to our people." An elderly Corvani with silver-white hair leaned forward. "We have heard of your kindness to young Kyle, Dr. Vasquez. For that you have our gratitude, but gratitude and acceptance are different things entirely." "I understand," Elena replied, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "I'm not asking for anything I haven't earned." "And what precisely have you earned?" The question came from a younger Corvani, whose expression radiated skepticism. "You performed one act of basic decency. Does that qualify you to lead people whose ways you cannot possibly understand?" Elena felt the weight of 23 pairs of eyes upon her, measuring her worth with standards she didn't fully comprehend. The urge to shrink back, to apologize for presuming to belong in their world, was almost overwhelming. Instead, she thought of Kyle, wise beyond his years, carrying burdens no child should bear. She thought of Zara's fierce protectiveness and Theron's quiet strength. She thought of the life debt that had brought her here and the marking that connected her to something larger than herself. "You're right," she said, addressing the skeptical Corvani directly. "I don't understand your ways. Not yet. But I understand healing, and I understand what it means to care for someone who can't care for themselves. If that's not enough of a foundation to build on, then perhaps I'm not the right person for whatever role you have in mind." The chamber fell silent. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Then from the back of the circle came an unexpected voice. "She speaks truth." Elena turned to see a Corvani she didn't recognize, middle-aged, with scars across his face and hands that spoke of old battles. "My name is Gareth Ironwing. I was injured in the border conflicts with the Ravenclaw clan 3 months ago. My wounds were beyond our healer's abilities. Poison from Ravenclaw blades that our medicine couldn't touch." Elena's attention sharpened. What kind of poison? Something that ate at the flesh, prevented healing, caused fever dreams that lasted for weeks. Gareth's expression was grim. "Our healers said I would die, but then word came from our war chief's nephew about a human healer who had treated him with unprecedented skill." Elena felt a chill of understanding. "Theron brought you to me. 3 weeks ago, you were treating a hawk with a similar condition, wing rot from infected wounds. You didn't even question why a stranger would ask you to treat another stranger's injuries. You simply helped." The memory came flooding back. A man who'd appeared at her clinic late one evening, badly injured, speaking little English but clearly in pain. She treated his wounds with a combination of traditional antibiotics and herbal remedies, never questioning his unusual injuries or how he'd sustained them. "You never told me who you were," Elena said. "I couldn't, but I watched you work, saw how you understood the poison's nature without explanation, how you adapted your treatment to something our healers had never encountered." Gareth stood slowly, favoring his left side. "You saved my life, Dr. Vasquez, not because you owed me anything, not because you expected reward, but because it was what needed to be done." Elena felt the chamber's atmosphere shift subtly. Several council members were nodding, and even the skeptical young Corvani looked thoughtful. "That is the second life debt you carry," Theron said quietly, "though I suspect you didn't realize it." Before Elena could respond, a commotion at the chamber's entrance drew everyone's attention. A Corvani warrior entered, moving with urgent purpose, and whispered something to Mira that made her expression darken. "What is it?" Theron demanded. Mira's voice was tight with tension. "Cassius Ravenclaw has sent envoys. They're demanding an audience with the council." "What do they want?" "To formally protest the proposed alliance with Dr. Vasquez." Mira's silver-flecked eyes found Elena across the chamber. "They're calling for her immediate expulsion from Corvani territory, claiming her presence violates the ancient laws of blood purity." Elena felt the temperature in the chamber drop several degrees. Around the circle, council members shifted uncomfortably, and she could see the political calculations playing out behind their eyes. "Let them come," Theron said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "If Cassius wants to challenge our right to honor our debts, he can do so openly." "Theron," Mira said carefully, "perhaps we should consider—" "No." Theron's tone brooked no argument. "Dr. Vasquez is here under our protection, as is her right. If the Ravenclaw clan wishes to dispute that, they can follow proper channels." Elena watched the interplay of politics and personal loyalty with growing understanding. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the fundamental question of what the Corvani would become in a changing world, and somehow she'd become the focal point around which that future would be decided. And then part 7, gathering storms, and somehow she'd become the focal point around which that future would be decided. The weight of that realization followed Elena back to Whitehaven like a shadow, growing heavier with each passing hour. Theron had flown her home as dawn broke over Ethermore, the hidden city's crystalline walls catching the first light and throwing it back in prismatic cascades that seemed to set the very air ablaze. The journey back felt different from there. Flight there, charged with tension and unspoken possibilities. When he'd set her down in her clinic's courtyard, his dark eyes had held a question he didn't voice. "I need time," Elena had said, and he'd nodded with the patience of someone accustomed to weighty decisions. "But not too much time," he'd warned. "Events are moving faster than either of us anticipated." That had been 3 days ago, and Elena was beginning to understand what he'd meant. The first dead raven appeared on her doorstep the morning after her return to Ethermore. She'd found it as she opened the clinic, its glossy black feathers dull with death, positioned with deliberate precision directly in front of her door. Elena had buried it in her garden, telling herself it was probably just a coincidence. Birds died all the time in the mountains. By the 3rd day, she'd found 17 more. They appeared everywhere, on her windowsills, in her herb garden, scattered across the path between her clinic and the main road. Each one positioned with the same deliberate care, each one clearly meant to be discovered. The ravens weren't diseased or injured, they showed no signs of violence or natural death. They simply lay there, their dark eyes clouded with death, like accusations made manifest. Elena was burying the latest discovery when Henrik appeared at her gate. The old ranger moved with unusual urgency, his weathered face creased with worry. "Doc, we need to talk," he said without preamble, "inside where unfriendly ears can't hear." Once they were safely within the clinic's walls, Henrik's carefully maintained composure cracked. "How many have you found?" "Dead ravens? 17, so far." Elena poured coffee with hands that trembled slightly. "Henrik, what's happening?" "The old families are stirring, the ones who remember the blood feuds, the border wars between the Crow people and their enemies." Henrik accepted the coffee, but didn't drink it. "My grandmother's journal mentions this, ravens dying without cause, left as warnings. It means the Ravenclaw clan is moving." Eleanor felt ice form in her stomach. "Cassius. You know that name?" Henrik's expression sharpened. "Theron warned me about him. Leader of the traditionalist faction, opposes any human integration." Elena sank into her chair, the weight of realization settling on her shoulders. "These dead ravens, they're a message, aren't they?" "Aye, a message saying that your involvement with the Nightwing clan will bring death to both sides." Henrik's voice was grim. "It's an old threat, Doc, older than you know. The Ravenclaw clan has always believed that mixing with humans weakens the Crow people, makes them vulnerable, and they're willing to kill to prevent it. They've done it before." Henrik opened his grandmother's journal to a page Elena hadn't seen. "Listen to this. The Ravenclaw warriors came at dawn, their faces painted with ash and blood. They killed young Thomas before he could transform, left his body where Sarah would find it. The message was clear. No Corvani who befriends humans will be tolerated." Elena's blood ran cold. "Thomas Nightwing, Theron's ancestor. The debt between our families runs deeper than you know, and the hatred of those who oppose it runs just as deep." Henrik closed the journal with careful hands. "Doc, I won't lie to you. If you accept Theron's proposal, you'll be painting a target on both your backs." Before Elena could respond, the sound of a car engine drew their attention. Through the window, she saw Marcus Webb's rental sedan pulling up to the clinic, and her heart sank. She'd hoped her former colleague had given up and returned to Denver. "Friend of yours?" Henrik asked, noting her expression. "Complicated," Elena muttered, then louder. "You should probably go, Henrik. This might get awkward." But Henrik didn't move. "Actually, Doc, I think I'll stay. Something tells me you might need a witness for whatever's about to happen." Marcus emerged from his car carrying a laptop bag and wearing the expression of someone who'd made an unpleasant discovery. When he entered the clinic, his gaze immediately fixed on Henrik with poorly concealed suspicion. "Elena, we need to talk. Privately." "Henrik stays," Elena said firmly. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it in front of him." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he opened his laptop and turned the screen toward her. "Fine. Then maybe your friend can help explain this." Elena found herself looking at a compilation of photographs, news articles, and what appeared to be folklore research. Images of unusual bird formations, reports of unexplained animal behavior in the Colorado Rockies, and academic papers on shapeshifter mythology filled the screen. "I spent the last week doing research," Marcus said, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and concern, "digging into the local legends around Whitehaven, following up on some very strange reports from the area. Do you know what I found?" Elena's mouth had gone dry. "Marcus, I found reports of massive bird formations that don't match any known migration patterns. I found folklore about crow people that goes back generations. I found eyewitness accounts of birds transforming into humans, Elena, and every single one of them centers around this area." Henrik made a soft sound that might have been amusement. "City folk sure are persistent when they set their minds to something." Marcus rounded on him. "You think this is funny? Your neighbor is involved in something that defies every law of nature and you're amused? Son, I've lived in these mountains for 73 years. I've learned that nature has more laws than city scientists know about. That's impossible. What Elena's describing, what these reports suggest, it violates everything we know about biology, about reality itself." Elena stood slowly, feeling the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. "What if I told you it was all true?" Marcus stared at her. "I'd say you've had some kind of breakdown. The isolation, the grief from the accident." "Don't!" Elena's voice carried a warning. "Don't you dare use David and the baby as ammunition in whatever point you're trying to make. I'm trying to save you." Marcus's composure cracked, revealing genuine desperation beneath his scientific skepticism. "Elena, listen to yourself. You're talking about shapeshifters like they're real. You're living in a fantasy because reality was too painful to handle." "Am I?" Elena moved to the window, looking out at the mountains that had become home. "Or maybe I'm finally living in a reality bigger than the one you're willing to accept." The argument was interrupted by a sound that made both Henrik and Elena freeze, the distinctive whistle of wind through massive wings. But this wasn't the controlled flight patterns Elena had learned to associate with friendly Corvani. This was something wilder, more aggressive. Through the window, she watched as 7 enormous ravens landed in her courtyard. These birds were different from any she'd seen before. Larger, with feathers that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and eyes that glowed with an unsettling intelligence. "Get away from the window," Henrik said sharply, but it was too late. The transformation that followed was unlike anything Elena had witnessed. Where Theron's change had been elegant and Kale's had been gentle, this was violent and deliberately intimidating. The ravens seemed to explode into human form, their shapes expanding with sounds like breaking bones and tearing fabric. 7 figures now stood in her courtyard, dressed in black leather and bearing weapons that looked ancient and deadly. At their head stood a man who radiated authority and barely contained violence. He was tall and powerfully built, with silver-streaked hair and eyes like chips of black ice. When he moved, it was with the predatory grace of something designed for killing. Cassius Ravenclaw, Henrik whispered. The clinic door didn't open. It simply disintegrated, the wood and metal crumbling to dust as if aged 1,000 years in. An instant. Marcus stumbled backward with a cry of terror, his laptop clattering to the floor, but Elena found herself frozen as Cassius stepped across the threshold. "Doctor Elena Vasquez," Cassius said, his voice carrying the sound of winter wind through dead trees. "At last we meet." Elena's throat felt like sandpaper. "You're not welcome here." "Aren't I?" Cassius's smile was sharp as a blade. "I would argue that your contamination of our bloodlines makes my presence necessary." Contamination. Elena felt anger cutting through her fear. "I saved a child's life. You interfered with the natural order. You inserted yourself into matters that are not your concern." Cassius moved closer, and Elena caught the scent of carrion and old blood that seemed to cling to him. "But I am not unreasonable. I offer you a choice, which is, renounce any claim to Corvani society, refuse Theron's proposal, return to your human existence, and never interfere with our people again." Cassius's black eyes held hers with hypnotic intensity. "Do this, and no harm will come to you or your kind. And if I refuse?" Cassius gestured toward the courtyard, where his warriors waited with patient malevolence. "Then you will learn what happens to humans who threaten the purity of our bloodlines." Elena felt the weight of decision pressing down on her like a physical force. Every rational part of her mind screamed that she should accept his offer, should return to her small, safe life, and pretend none of this had ever happened. Instead, she thought of Kyle's wise eyes and gentle strength. She thought of Zara's fierce protection and Theron's quiet dedication to his people. She thought of the marking on her shoulder and the life debts that bound her to a world larger than anything she'd ever imagined. "No," she said quietly. Cassius's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around him, a sense of gathering power that made Elena's skin crawl. "You're certain?" "I'm certain." "Then you've chosen your fate." Cassius raised his hand, and Elena felt something slam into her mind like a physical blow. Images flooded her consciousness, visions of death and destruction, of ravens falling from the sky like black rain, of cities burning while shapeshifters fought shapeshifters in wars that would consume both human and Corvani worlds. The attack was overwhelming, designed to break her will through sheer terror. Elena felt her knees buckle, felt her sanity straining under the onslaught of prophetic nightmares. Through the chaos, she heard Marcus screaming, heard Henrik shouting, something in a language she didn't recognize. Then suddenly, the assault stopped. Elena gasped, finding herself on her knees in the middle of her clinic's floor. The psychic residue of Cassius's attack still echoed in her mind, but something else had taken its place. A warm, protective presence that felt like strong wings sheltering her from the storm. Theron stood in the destroyed doorway, his dark eyes blazing with fury. Behind him, Zara and 3 other Corvani warriors formed a defensive line, their weapons drawn and their expressions promising violence. "Get away from her, Cassius," Theron said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of command. Cassius smiled coldly. "Young Nightwing, come to protect your pet human? I've come to enforce our laws, the one that says guests under our protection are not to be threatened by cowards who attack the innocent." "Innocent?" Cassius laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "She has contaminated herself with our secrets, claimed rights that belong to pure blood alone. There is nothing innocent about her presence among us. Elena Vasquez has earned her place through service and sacrifice. The Council has acknowledged her debts, accepted her value to our people." Theron moved protectively in front of Elena, his presence solid and reassuring. "If you have complaints about our decisions, address them through proper channels." "Proper channels," Meek Cassius's facade of civility finally cracked, revealing the hatred beneath. You would speak to me of proper channels while you prepare to bind yourself to this human mongrel, while you plan to corrupt our bloodlines with her weakness? Elena struggled to her feet, her mind still reeling from the psychic attack, but through the confusion, one thing became crystal clear. She was tired of being talked about like she wasn't there. I may be human, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, but I'm not weak, and I'm not going anywhere. Both Theron and Cassius turned to look at her, surprise flickering across their features. Elena stepped forward, placing herself between the two war chiefs despite the obvious danger. You want me to renounce my connection to the Corvani? She said, addressing Cassius directly. You want me to pretend that saving Kale's life doesn't matter, that the debts and obligations mean nothing? Yes, then you're going to be disappointed. Elena felt the marking on her shoulder pulse with warmth, felt the life debts that bound her to Theron's people resonating in her bones. Because I accept Theron's proposal. I accept the alliance, the responsibilities, and whatever comes with them. The silence that followed her declaration was absolute. Even Marcus, who'd been cowering behind the examination table, stopped his terrified whimpering. Cassius's expression went through a series of changes. Surprise, fury, and finally, a cold satisfaction that made Elena's blood freeze. So be it, he said softly. You have chosen war, Elena Vasquez. I hope you're prepared for the consequences. He gestured to his warriors, and they began their transformation back to crow form with the same violent energy that had marked their arrival. As they took to the sky, Cassius called out one final warning. Tell your human friends to stay indoors after dark, Nightwing. The Ravenclaw clan no longer recognizes their protection. The threat hung in the air long after the dark. Shapes had disappeared into the mountain peaks. Elena found herself shaking, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what she'd just committed to. Elena, Theron said softly, turning to face her. Are you certain? There's no taking back what you just said. Elena looked around her destroyed, Glynic, at Henrik's worried face and Marcus's traumatized expression. She thought about the safe, predictable life she was abandoning and the dangerous, impossible future she was choosing instead. I'm certain, she said, and meant it completely. Theron's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. Then, welcome to the Corvani, Elena Vasquez. May you never have cause to regret this decision. Elena hoped he was right, but as she looked toward the mountains where Cassius and his warriors had disappeared, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real storm was only just beginning. Elena hoped he was right, but as she looked toward the mountains where Cassius and his warriors had disappeared, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real storm was only just beginning. The feeling proved prophetic sooner than she'd anticipated. The formal ceremony took place 3 days later in Ethermoor's council chambers. Elena had expected something elaborate, but Corvani traditions favored symbolic weight over elaborate pageantry. She stood before the crystalline walls, with Theron beside her, while the gathered council spoke words in the old language that seemed to resonate through the stone itself. Mira Stormfeather officiated, her silver-flecked eyes unreadable as she bound Elena's hand to Theron's with cords of woven starlight, literally woven from some Corvani technique that captured actual light and made it solid. The binding was warm, against Elena's skin, pulsing gently with a life of its own. By wind and wing, by earth and sky, by the bonds that tie all living things together, Mira intoned, I witness the joining of Elena Vasquez, friend to the clan, with Theron Nightwing, war chief of the Northern Reaches. Let their union bridge 2 worlds, and let their strength protect all who shelter beneath their wings. Elena felt the change the moment the ceremony concluded. The marking Zara had given her months ago flared with new intensity, spreading across her shoulders like wings of warmth. But more than that, she could sense things she'd never felt before, the presence of every Corvani in the city, their emotions and intentions flowing through her awareness like a river of consciousness. "It will take time to adjust," Theron said quietly, his hand still bound to hers. "The full bond doesn't settle for several days." Before Elena could respond, a commotion erupted in the chamber's entrance. A Corvani warrior burst in, his face streaked with blood and his clothing torn from violent transformation. "War Chief!" he gasped, stumbling toward the council circle. "The Ravenclaw clan. They've attacked the outer settlements. Wind Hollow and Stormreach are burning." Elena felt Theron's shock and fury through their new bond, the emotions hitting her like physical blows. Around the chamber, council members rose to their feet with cries of alarm and outrage. "Casualties?" Theron demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Unknown, but heavy. They hit at dawn, used fire magic to destroy the defensive barriers." The messenger swayed on his feet. "And War Chief, they're not just attacking us, reports coming in of human settlements under assault as well." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. "Whitehaven?" "Among others. The Ravenclaw forces are striking at anything connected to the integration, human or Corvani." Eleanor was moving before conscious thought took over, heading for the chamber's exit with Theron close behind. The new bond between them hummed with shared purpose and barely controlled panic. "We need to get to Whitehaven," Eleanor said as they reached the launching platform. "Henrik, Marcus, they're defenseless against this kind of attack." "Eleanor, wait!" Theron caught her arm. "I know you're worried about your friends, but we need to coordinate our response. If we react without strategy, if we don't react immediately, innocent people die." Eleanor pulled free, her voice carrying new authority. "Theron, I understand military tactics aren't my area, but medical triage is. The longer we wait, the more casualties we'll have to treat." Something shifted in Theron's expression, recognition of her expertise, acceptance of her judgment in her own domain. "You're right, but we go together, and we go prepared for war." The flight to Whitehaven was unlike any Elena had experienced. Instead of Theron carrying her alone, she found herself surrounded by a full war formation, 30 Corvani warriors in crow form, moving with deadly purpose through skies that seemed darker than they should have been. The darkness, Elena realized with growing horror, was smoke. Whitehaven was burning. Not the entire village, but enough buildings to fill the air with ash and the acrid smell of destruction. Elena could see figures moving through the streets, some human, some the distinctive shapes of Corvani in combat form, all engaged in chaotic battle. Theron landed first, transforming and immediately drawing the curved blade Elena had seen him carry. Around them, his warriors spread out in defensive formation, their own weapons gleaming in the firelight. "Where do you want to set up triage?" Theron asked, his voice all business despite the chaos around them. Elena looked around, assessing the tactical situation with skills she hadn't known she possessed. "The community center. It's stone construction, defensible, and big enough for multiple casualties. Can your people secure it?" "Consider it done." Theron gave rapid orders in the Corvani language, and half his warriors peeled off toward the building Elena had indicated. What followed was the longest day of Elena's life. The community center became a field hospital that defied every convention of medical practice she'd ever learned. Human and Corvani casualties arrived in equal numbers, many suffering from wounds that no earthly weapon could have caused. Elena found herself treating burns that seemed to consume flesh from the inside out, lacerations that wept shadows instead of blood, and injuries that defied classification entirely. But the Corvani physiology she'd learned from treating Kale served her well, and her human medical training adapted to alien anatomy with surprising flexibility. "Doctor, we've got incoming," called one of Theron's warriors, a young woman named Lyra who'd appointed herself Elena's assistant. 3 critical mixed casualties. Elena looked up from the Corvani warrior whose wing she'd been setting to see a stretcher team arriving with their latest patients. Her heart nearly stopped when she recognized one of them. Henrik lay unconscious on the makeshift stretcher, his weathered face pale and his left arm twisted at an unnatural angle. But it was what Elena could see through her new, bond-enhanced senses that made her stomach lurch, darkness spreading through his body like poison, eating away at his life force with methodical hunger. "Ravenclaw magic," Lyra said grimly. "Same. Poison that's been killing our people." Elena's hands moved without conscious direction, drawing on knowledge that felt older than her medical training. The marking on her shoulders flared with heat as she pressed her palms to Henrik's chest, feeling for the source of the corruption. "Elena," Theron's voice, tight with worry and something else. "We have a problem." She looked up to see him, standing in the doorway, his expression grim. Behind him stood Zara, but the young warrior's usual confidence was gone, replaced by something Elena had never seen before: fear. "What is it?" Elena asked, though part of her already knew the answer would be devastating. "Kyle," Zara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They took Kyle." Elena felt the world tilt. Through the bond, she sensed Theron's anguish and rage, emotions so powerful they threatened to overwhelm her own consciousness. "When? How?" "He was with a training group in the Eastern Peaks. They were overrun an hour ago." Zara's hands clenched into fists. "Cassius sent a message. He'll trade Kyle's life for your withdrawal from Corvani society." "No." Elena's voice was flat, absolute. "We don't negotiate with terrorists." "Elena," Theron said carefully, "he's my nephew, the heir to our clan. If something happens to him, it won't be because we gave in to extortion." Elena stood, leaving Henrik in Lyra's capable hands. "Theron, if we abandon our principles the moment they're tested, then everything we fought for means nothing." Around the room, other casualties had gone quiet, listening to the conversation that would determine their future. Elena could feel the weight of their attention, the hope and fear radiating from both human and Corvani wounded. "But there's another consideration," Elena continued, her voice carrying new authority. "Cassius isn't just threatening Kale. He's threatening everything our union represents. The possibility that our peoples can coexist, can be stronger together than apart." Mira Stormfeather appeared in the doorway, her usual composure cracked with exhaustion and worry. "Elena's right. This isn't just about one life, precious as Kale is to all of us. If we yield to Cassius now, we signal that the Ravenclaw clan can dictate terms to the entire Corvani nation." "Then what do you propose?" Theron asked, though Elena could sense through their bond that he already knew her answer. "We rescue him," Elena said simply, "and we end this conflict before more innocents suffer." Theron stared at her for a long moment, then smiled, the first genuine expression of joy she'd seen from him all day. "That," he said, "is exactly what I was hoping you'd say." Over the next several hours, as Elena continued treating casualties and Theron coordinated with his military commanders, a plan began to take shape. It was dangerous, probably suicidal, and required a level of cooperation between human and Corvani, forces that had never been attempted before. It was also, Elena realized as she watched Henrik's slow recovery and saw the determination in the eyes of their mixed army, exactly the kind of impossible undertaking that could forge two peoples into one. "Are you ready for this?" Theron asked as sunset approached and their preparations neared completion. Elena looked around the transformed community center, at humans and Corvani working side by side, at wounded warriors of both species protecting each other, at the future they were all fighting to create. "I'm ready," she said, and felt the truth of it resonate through every fiber of her being. The war for integration was about to reach its climax, and Elena Vasquez, former veterinarian turned bridge between worlds, intended to see it through. And to the end, the war for integration was about to reach its climax, and Elena Vasquez, former veterinarian turned bridge between worlds, intended to see it through to the end. The Ravenclaw stronghold sat like a cancer in the heart of the most treacherous peaks, accessible only through a maze of ice-covered ledges and wind-carved chasms that had claimed countless lives over the centuries. Even approaching in crow form was dangerous. The air currents were unpredictable, and Cassius had positioned sentries at every conceivable entry point. Elena clung to Theron's back as they navigated the lethal approach, feeling his muscles strain against the brutal mountain winds. Through their bond, she could sense his worry, not just for Kyle's safety, but for her own. She was the weak link in this operation, the human element that could compromise their stealth at any moment. "I can hear your doubts," she whispered. "Against the wind." Theron's mental voice reached her through their connection, warm despite the circumstances. "Not doubts, concerns. There's a difference. Such as the fact that we're about to assault the most heavily defended position in Corvani territory with a force of 12 warriors and 1 untrained human." Elena almost smiled. "When you put it like that, it does sound challenging." They landed on a narrow ledge 300 feet below the stronghold's main entrance, where the rest of their strike team was already assembled. Elena recognized most of them, warriors who'd volunteered despite knowing the odds were against survival. What surprised her was seeing Mira among them, the advisor's usual political robes replaced by combat leather. "Mira?" Elena asked as Theron set her down. "I thought you'd be coordinating from Ethermore." Mira's silver-flecked eyes held an emotion Elena couldn't quite read. "Kyle is precious to all of us, Dr. Vasquez. Besides, someone needs to ensure this rescue doesn't turn into a massacre." Elena sensed there was more to Mira's presence than concern for Kyle. But before she could pursue it, Theron was gathering the team for final instructions. "Remember, this is extraction, not elimination," he said, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "We get Kale and withdraw. If we can avoid engaging Cassius directly—" "We won't be able to avoid it," Elena interrupted, earning surprised looks from the assembled warriors. "He's not just holding Kale as a bargaining chip. This is personal for him, and he'll want to face us himself." "You sound certain," Mira observed. "I am certain." Elena couldn't explain how she knew, but something in her new connection to the Corvani world whispered that Cassius was driven by more than political ideology. This isn't about preserving bloodline purity. There's old pain driving him, and he won't be satisfied with anything less than direct confrontation. Theron studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "If that's true, we need to be prepared. For a fight, we can't win through conventional means." The assault began with a coordinated strike on the outer defenses. Elena watched in fascination as the Corvani warriors moved with fluid precision, shifting between human and crow forms as tactics demanded. But what amazed her more was her own ability to follow their movements, to anticipate their needs and position herself to provide support. When Lyra took a crossbow bolt through her wing, Elena was there with medical supplies before the young warrior hit the ground. When the team needed a distraction to breach the inner courtyard, Elena found herself calling out to the wild ravens that nested in the surrounding cliffs, and to her astonishment, they responded. The birds came in a black cloud, hundreds of them diving and wheeling around the Ravenclaw sentries in patterns that looked chaotic but felt coordinated to Elena's enhanced senses. Through some instinct she didn't understand, she could feel their simple thoughts, guide their movements with gentle suggestions that felt as natural as breathing. Elena. Theron's voice held wonder and something else, recognition. How are you doing that? I don't know, she replied honestly, but even as she spoke, pieces began falling into place. Hendrik's grandmother's journal, the ease with which she'd connected to Kale, the way Corvani magic seemed to respond to her touch. Theron, I need to ask you something. Is it possible for humans to have Corvani ancestry? Mixed bloodlines from generations ago? Theoretically, yes, but such lineages are rare, and usually... Theron's eyes widened as understanding hit him. Your affinity for our magic, your ability to bond so completely. Elena, I think you may be more Corvani than either of us realized. The revelation would have to wait. They'd reached the stronghold's heart, where Cassius waited with Kale bound at his feet. The boy was conscious but clearly weakened, dark, veins spreading across his skin from whatever poison Cassius had used to keep him compliant. Theron Nightwing, Cassius called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Come to surrender your human pet? I've come to take back what belongs to my family, Theron replied, stepping into the circular chamber with his weapons raised. What belongs to your family? Cassius laughed bitterly. You mean the boy whose bloodline you've already corrupted by binding yourself to this mongrel? Or perhaps you mean the ancient laws you've trampled in pursuit of your unnatural alliance? Elena stepped out of the shadows, feeling the weight of every gaze in the chamber. Or maybe he means the future you're trying to destroy because you're too afraid to let go of the past. Cassius's black eyes fixed on her with hatred so pure it was almost a physical force. Afraid? You think I'm afraid of you, little human? I think you're afraid of what I represent. Elena moved closer, ignoring the weapons pointed at her from every direction. Change. The possibility that the old ways might not be the only ways. The chance that your people might be stronger for embracing connection rather than isolation. Connection? Cassius's voice cracked like a whip. I've seen what connection with humans brings. I watched my sister die screaming in human laboratories, her body cut open by your kind's scientists who wanted to understand how we transform. I saw my parents executed as unnatural abominations by human soldiers who feared what they couldn't control. Elena felt the weight of his pain, the decades of rage and loss that had twisted his noble intentions into hatred. I'm sorry, that was wrong and terrible, and save your pity, Cassius snarled. Your species has proven what it does to anything different, anything special. You corrupt it, cage it, or kill it. Not all of us, Elena said quietly, and not anymore. Cassius, look around you. Look at the warriors who came here with us, Corvani and human fighting side by side. Look at the casualties we've been treating together, the lives we've saved by working as one people instead of two. For a moment, something flickered in Cassius's expression, uncertainty perhaps, or the shadow of old hope. Then his face hardened again. Pretty words, but words don't erase history. He raised his hand, dark energy crackling between his fingers. Your presence ends here, Elena Vasquez, along with this foolish dream of integration. The attack came, with overwhelming force, but this time Elena was ready. The bond with Theron flared to life, channeling his strength and combat experience through their connection. More than that, she felt the presence of every Corvani in the chamber, including, to her amazement, several of Cassius's own warriors whose loyalty was wavering. When Mira stepped between Elena and Cassius's magical assault, deflecting the worst, of it with shields of crystallized air, Elena understood that the tide of battle had truly turned. "Enough, Cassius," Mira said, her voice carrying absolute authority. "Stand down or face the judgment of the full council for attacking a bonded war chief's mate." Cassius stared at his former ally with shock and betrayal. "Mira, you can't possibly support this madness." "I support the future of our people," Mira replied calmly, "and that future lies in adaptation, not in clinging to old wounds." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but Kyle chose that moment to speak, his young voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Uncle Cassius," he said, struggling to sit up despite his bonds, "my grandmother was human." The words fell into absolute silence. Cassius turned to stare at the boy, his face cycling through disbelief, horror, and finally a kind of broken understanding. "That's impossible. The bloodlines are more mixed than anyone wants to admit," Elena said gently. "Cassius, Henrik's grandmother was part Corvani. So was mine, apparently. We've been intertwined for generations, whether we acknowledged it or not." Cassius's shoulders sagged, as if the weight of his hatred had finally become too much to bear. "Then everything I've fought for—" "Everything you fought for was based on a lie," Theron said, moving to cut Cale's bonds. "The question now is what you choose to do with the truth." Elena watched Cassius's face as he processed the revelation, seeing the exact moment when his certainty crumbled and left him facing a future he'd never imagined possible. The war wasn't over yet, but she could see its ending in his eyes. The war wasn't over yet, but she could see its ending in his eyes. What Elena saw in Cassius's expression as the truth settled around him wasn't defeat. It was the terrible relief of a man who'd finally been given permission to stop carrying a burden that had never truly been his to bear. 6 months later, Elena stood in the courtyard of what had once been her simple veterinary clinic and marveled at how completely her world had transformed. The building had been expanded with Corvani architecture that seemed to grow directly from the mountain stone, creating treatment facilities that could accommodate both human and Corvani patients with equal ease. Through the large windows that now dominated the eastern wall, she could see patients in both forms moving between examination rooms. A young Corvani, learning to control his first transformation, worked with a human physical therapist who'd trained specifically for such cases, while in the adjacent room, a human hiker received treatment for altitude sickness from a Corvani healer whose understanding of mountain conditions was unparalleled. "The integration clinic," Theron said, appearing at her shoulder with 2 cups of the coffee blend that had become their morning ritual. Human beings enhanced with Corvani herbs that somehow made everything taste like sunlight and possibility. "Are you satisfied with what we've built?" Elena accepted the coffee and leaned back against his solid warmth, feeling their bond hum with contentment. "I'm satisfied with what we're building," she corrected. "This is just the beginning." Through the bond, she felt his amusement at her correction and his deeper agreement with the sentiment. The clinic had become more than a medical facility. It was a symbol of cooperation, a place where the artificial barriers between their peoples dissolved in the face of shared need and mutual respect. "Speaking of building," Theron said, "Mira sent word that the Council has approved the formal diplomatic protocols you proposed. Human representatives will be welcomed in Ethermore for the first time in our recorded history." Elena smiled, remembering the months of careful negotiation that had led to this moment. The protocols she'd developed weren't about assimilation or dominance. They were about creating frameworks for voluntary cooperation while preserving the distinct strengths of both cultures. "And Cassius?" she asked, though she already knew the answer through their bond. leading the Committee on Cultural Preservation. He's thrown himself into documenting our traditions with the fervor of someone making amends. Theron's voice carried a note of fond exasperation. I think he's written more in the past 6 months than our historians have produced in the past decade. The transformation in Cassius had been one of the most unexpected developments of the integration process. Faced with the reality that his crusade had been built on false premises, he channeled his considerable passion into ensuring that Corvani culture would be preserved and honored even as it evolved. His detailed chronicles of their history, customs, and beliefs were already being translated into human languages, creating bridges of understanding that went far beyond mere political cooperation. A knock at the clinic's door interrupted Elena's thoughts. She opened it to find Henrik standing on the threshold, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a delegation that made Elena's heart race with recognition. Representatives from both human and Corvani communities, all dressed in formal attire that somehow managed to honor both traditions. "Doc," Henrik said, his weathered face creased with a smile that seemed to contain decades of satisfaction, "I believe it's time." Elena looked past him to see the wedding preparations that had been quietly taking shape in the meadow behind her clinic. Tables arranged in patterns that honored both human and Corvani customs, decorations that somehow made starlight solid and wove it through mountain flowers, and guests who represented the impossible dream that had become reality. The ceremony itself was unlike anything that had ever been attempted. Elena wore a dress that Corvani artisans had woven from threads of captured moonlight, while Theron's formal robes incorporated patterns that told the story of both their people's histories. The vows they spoke were in 3 languages: English, the formal Corvani tongue, and the older language that Henrik revealed he'd learned from his grandmother. "By the old covenants and the new," Henrik said, his voice carrying an authority Elena had never heard from him before. "By the bonds that have always existed, whether we acknowledge them or not, I witness the joining of 2 hearts, 2 peoples, 2 futures that were always meant to be one." As he spoke, Elena finally understood Henrik's true role in all of this. He wasn't just a keeper of old stories. He was a guardian of treaties that predated living memory, agreements between their peoples that had been maintained in secret for generations by families like his. When the ceremony concluded, and Elena found herself truly married to a man who could transform into a crow, she felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. This wasn't the end of her grief over David and their lost child. That would always be part of her. But it was the beginning of something new, something that honored both her past and her future. The celebration that followed lasted until dawn, with humans and Corvani sharing stories, music, and foods that created fusion cuisines neither culture had imagined before. Elena watched Cale, fully recovered and grown taller in the months since. His rescue, teaching human children games that involved minor shape-shifting techniques. She saw Marcus, who'd returned from Denver specifically for the wedding, deep in conversation with Corvani scholars about the intersection of magic and medicine. Most surprisingly, she saw Cassius sitting with a group of elderly humans who'd begun sharing memories of unusual encounters from their younger days. Encounters that suddenly made perfect sense in light of everything they'd learned. "Regrets?" Theron asked, as they finally found a moment alone together, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. Elena considered the question seriously. 2 years ago, she'd been a broken woman hiding from the world in a remote clinic, convinced that her capacity for love had died in a car accident. Now she was married to a shapeshifter, helping to bridge 2 civilizations and carrying responsibilities she'd never imagined. "No regrets," she said finally, "but I do have questions about what comes next." "Such as?" Elena gestured toward their guests, toward the clinic that had become a symbol of cooperation, toward the mountains that held communities learning to trust each other for the first time in generations. This is just one small corner of the world, Theron. There are other Corvani settlements, other human communities that don't know any of this exists. The real work is just beginning. Theron's smile was radiant with possibility. Are you suggesting we have a responsibility to share what we've learned? I'm suggesting we have an opportunity to prove that differences don't have to mean division. Eleanor leaned into his warmth, feeling their bond pulse with shared determination. That healing is possible, even when the wounds run generations deep. As the sun climbed higher over the mountains, Elena and Theron began planning the next phase of their work together. The integration clinic would expand, sending teams to other communities ready to explore cooperation. The protocols they'd developed would be tested in new contexts, refined and improved through experience. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, conflicts, moments when the old prejudices threatened to overwhelm the new understanding. But Elena had learned something important in her journey, from isolated veterinarian to bridge between worlds. Some transformations were worth any amount of struggle. The story of Elena Vasquez and Theron Nightwing was just beginning, but as they stood together, watching the world wake up to new possibilities, Elena knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they'd faced everything else. Together, with wings spread wide enough to shelter two peoples learning to become one. In the distance, a mixed flock of ravens and crows took flight, their wings catching the morning light as they soared toward horizons that had never looked more promising. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.